Let me bring in David French now. David, you caught my eye yesterday because you're talking about the international laws of war and how they are apply in this situation. And you said some reporters don't know those laws, don't understand it. So tell us your perspective after hearing the IDF spokesman and the AP editor.
Right. I served in Iraq during the surge and made some of the very same targeting decisions that are being made right now. And I served as an Army lawyer and applied the laws of war in these contexts. And the laws actually that apply are pretty simple. The facts are complicated. The simple truth is that you do, in fact, convert a civilian target to a military target if a military force uses that civilian target or that civilian facility. And that includes any kind of civilian facility. That includes a mosque. That includes a hospital, that includes a school. There are no targets off limits once an army decides to use it. So then the big question becomes exactly the one you asked. What's the evidence? What's the evidence that this was being used by Hamas? And if it was being used by Hamas, it's a legitimate military target, end of story. And Israel was right to warn people to minimize or to remove any civilian casualties. So that's why I say the law is relatively simple. If Hamas used that building, it's a military target, period, full stop. If they did not use that building, then, of course, that strike is unjustified by the laws of war. The law here is simple. The facts are complicated. That's why you need to ultimately see the facts here.
It feels to me like everybody involved walks around like they're stepping on broken glass, sometimes literally. But in conversations about this conflict, it's like everybody is walking around on broken glass. It's incredibly complicated and sensitive, and so many minds are made up. How do you recommend news consumers make sense of this conflict?
Well, here's a good rule of thumb. Don't believe anybody automatically. Is one thing. Don't decide that I am definitely going to believe this statement that I see or this statement that I see based on my preconceived biases. But there are still some facts that are undisputable and some laws that are undisputable. So, for example, it is in fact a war crime to direct unaimed rocket fire at a civilian city. That's a war crime. It is a war crime to do, for example, what Hamas does, which is not wear military uniforms often and try to blend in with civilian populations. When the facts show that, that's a war crime. If Israel did not have evidence that Hamas was in that building, and it targeted a civilian building without evidence that Hamas was there, that would be a war crime. So these are things where you need to understand the law. You can't blend in with civilians. You can't intentionally target civilians if you're a combatant. But if a combatant uses a civilian structure, then that civilian structure loses its protection. All of these legal standards are pretty easy to understand. What becomes difficult is discerning the facts. However, we have to be clear that some of the facts are pretty clear. It is absolutely clear that Hamas is volleying rockets that are not aimed at Israeli cities. That is a war crime. Every one of those rocket launches is a war crime. And sometimes I feel like what we do is we sort of just presume Hamas is going to do that and don't hold them to the same standard that we say hold Israel. We should hold the combatants to the same standard. And if we know one combatant is committing war crimes on a wholesale basis, they need to be condemned for that universally by the same international media and the same international establishment that is holding Israel to a high standard. And it's right to hold Israel to a high standard.
David, thank you very much for coming on and sharing this. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.